61 years old, and Margaret Coyle was left to die in a whiteout on the high plains of Wyoming. Her own nephew's tracks, the last thing she saw before the snow swallowed the world. He was the one who cast her out, Thomas Coyle, her late husband's brother's son, who had decided that a widow with no sons and a weak hip was a burden the family ranch could no longer carry, and who left her on the road with a lame mule for silver dollars and a wool blanket, telling her the cold would settle the matter. The family was too polite to settle themselves. She did not die. She walked through the night by memory and stubbornness alone, and when the storm broke she had $11 to her name, counting what she'd sewn into her hem for just such a day, and with it she bought the only thing anyone in the town of Larkspur Hollow would sell to a woman with a mule and a limp, 22 acres of played-out, abandoned homestead at the edge of the county, sold for $8 because the last family who'd lived there had vanished without a word 20 years before, and because the well was said to be cursed, and because no sane person believed there was a single thing of value left standing on it. It was, by every measure the town could offer, a foolish, desperate purchase made by a woman with nothing left to lose. But sealed inside the walls of that crumbling homestead was a secret 2 generations old, one that would not only restore Margaret Coyle's life but would quietly, justly, unravel the fortunes of the very family that had left her for dead. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Margaret Coyle. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, a town, a home, a life others have written off, tell us in the comments, because this story was written for you. Margaret had not always been a woman easily discarded. She was born in 1837 in a river town in Missouri, the daughter of a blacksmith named Elias Whitfield, a man of enormous hands and unhurried patience who taught her, against the custom of the age, to read the grain of wood and the temper of iron, to understand that everything discarded by one person carried value for another, if only you knew how to look. Her mother, Ruth, kept the ledger for her father's forge, and it was from Ruth that Margaret learned her second great skill, the one that would matter more than any other in the years to come: the patient, careful reading of numbers, of accounts, of the small discrepancies that told the true story beneath what people wanted you to believe. Margaret grew up watching her mother catch a dishonest supplier 3 separate times simply by noticing that a column of figures did not sit right in her stomach, long before her eyes could prove it on paper. It was, Ruth told her once, the same skill as her father's with the iron. You had to know what a true thing felt like before you could spot the false one. She married young, at 19, to a quiet, sturdy rancher named Daniel Coyle, who had come through Missouri driving cattle north and who saw in Margaret something steadier and rarer than the town girls who fluttered after him. They moved together to the Wyoming territory in 1858, when the land was still raw and the winters still killed the unprepared, and they built, plank by plank and season by season, a modest but honest cattle operation on the edge of what would become Larkspur Hollow. Daniel had a brother, Silas Coyle, older and hungrier, who had staked a larger claim a few miles off and who watched Daniel's slow, careful prosperity with an envy he never fully hid. Where Daniel built with patience, Silas built with borrowed money and bluster, and where Daniel treated his hands fairly and his neighbors honestly, Silas cut corners that always seemed, somehow, to cost other people rather than himself. Margaret noticed this the way her mother had noticed the false weight in a shipment of nails, a discomfort in her stomach long before she had proof in her hands, and she kept her distance from Silas's family as much as courtesy allowed, though she was always warm to his young son Thomas, who grew up soft-spoken and watchful in a household of shouting. Margaret and Daniel had no children who lived past infancy, a grief that settled into Margaret's bones and never fully left her, but it also meant that when Daniel died of a fever in 1881, there was no clear heir to the small, well-run Coyle ranch, and it was Silas, older, louder, and by then the more prominent Coyle in the valley, who quietly absorbed her husband's herd and grazing rights into his own operation, promising Margaret a home and a portion of the profits for as long as she lived. She had been suspicious even then, that same old discomfort stirring in her stomach, but grief had worn her down, and she had no living family of her own to turn to, and so she accepted the arrangement and moved into a small room in Silas's house, doing the accounts for his ranch just as her mother had once done for her father's forge, because it was the one skill that still gave her a sense of purpose and place in a household that increasingly treated her as an inconvenience to be managed. She kept those ledgers faithfully for 11 years, and in that time she noticed things. Numbers that did not sit right in her stomach, entries in Silas's hand that seemed designed to obscure rather than record. But she said nothing because she had learned, by then, the particular silence required of a woman with no standing of her own. Silas died in 1893, and it was his son Thomas, then 31 and recently married to a sharp, ambitious young woman named Cora, who inherited the ranch and with it, the arrangement to house his aging aunt by marriage. For a few years Thomas honored the old promise well enough, though Margaret could feel the household's patience with her thinning like cloth worn too long in the same spot, could feel herself being spoken of in the third person even when she was sitting in the room, could feel her usefulness measured and found wanting now that her eyes had grown too weak for fine ledger work and her hip too stiff for the long days it once allowed. It was Cora, Margaret always suspected, who first raised the question of what a childless old widow was really worth to a growing family with 2 sons of their own to provide for, and it was Thomas, soft-spoken Thomas who had once been the gentlest child in Silas's loud household, who finally found the nerve to answer that question in the cruelest possible way. The blizzard came in the second week of November 1897, one of those Wyoming storms that arrived with almost no warning, a green-gray light in the sky and then, within an hour, a wall of white that erased the horizon entirely. Thomas told Margaret they were moving cattle to lower pasture ahead of the storm and that she should ride along in the wagon to help mind the gate at the county road, a task she had done a dozen times before without complaint. But when the wagon reached the fork where the county road split toward town, Thomas stopped, helped her down with a strange formal courtesy that should have warned her, and told her, in a voice with no more feeling in it than a man reading a grocery list, that the ranch could no longer carry her, that she had become an expense the family's future could not bear, and that she should walk on to town and find what charity she could there. Then he turned the wagon and drove back into the whiteness, and Margaret Coyle, 61 years old, stood alone on a disappearing road in a storm that had already claimed 2 men from the county that same week, and understood, with the same cold clarity her mother once brought to a false column of figures, exactly what her family had decided she was worth. She did not allow herself to weep, not then. She wrapped her wool blanket tighter, felt for the small hard lump of coins sewn into her hem, the habit of a woman who had learned young never to keep all her eggs in one basket, and began to walk, using the fence line she could just make out through the snow as her only compass, counting her steps the way her father had taught her to count hammer strikes, one at a time, never looking too far ahead. She walked through the night and into the gray hour before dawn, when the storm finally slackened, and she came stumbling into the outskirts of Larkspur Hollow half frozen but alive, taken in by a startled shopkeeper's wife who rubbed the feeling back into her hands and fed her broth and asked no questions Margaret was not yet ready to answer. When she was strong enough to stand and think clearly again, 3 days later, Margaret Coyle took stock of her situation with the same unsentimental clarity she had once brought to her mother's ledgers. She had $11 in the world. She had no family who would claim her, no home, and a body that would never again be as strong as it once was. She also had, she realized, something Thomas and Cora had never valued in her and had therefore never bothered to take away, her eyes for a true thing among false ones, and her willingness to look where others refused to look. When she heard the town clerk mention, almost as a joke, that the old Prentice homestead out past Miller's Creek was being sold off for taxes owed, 22 acres with a fallen-in barn and a farmhouse nobody had set foot in for 20 years, sold cheap because of the well and because of the stories, Margaret asked how cheap. $8, the clerk said and laughed and told her nobody in their right mind would take it. Margaret Coyle, who had just been left to die in a blizzard by the family she trusted with the last of her strength, decided that her right mind and the town's right mind might no longer have very much in common, and she paid her $8 the following morning. The Prentice homestead sat in a shallow bowl of land where the wind seemed to gather and circle rather than pass through, and the farmhouse, when Margaret first walked up to it with her borrowed mule and her few remaining possessions, looked less like a house than like a memory of one, its porch sagging, its windows blind with dust and old newspaper, its chimney leaning at an angle that suggested it was only stubbornness holding it up at all. The barn had collapsed inward years before, its timbers silvered and soft with rot, and the well the clerk had mentioned sat capped with warped boards a few yards from the kitchen door, the source, Margaret would later learn, of most of the ghost stories that kept curious children and cautious buyers away. She stood in the frozen dooryard that first afternoon with the low winter sun slanting gold and merciless across the ruin of it, and she understood exactly how the town saw her purchase. An old, discarded woman spending her last coins on an old, discarded house, 2 ruins agreeing to keep each other company until the weather finished what the blizzard had started. But Margaret had learned long ago from a father who could see the grain in warped wood and a mother who could feel a false number in her stomach, that ruin and worthlessness were not the same thing. And so instead of despair she felt something closer to purpose stir in her for the first time since Daniel's death. She spent that first evening simply walking the rooms with a lantern, noting which floorboards were sound, which walls were merely dusty rather than rotted, cataloging the house's true condition the way she had once cataloged the true condition of Silas's accounts, refusing to let the surface story of neglect obscure whatever honest truth lay beneath it. It was in the small back room off the kitchen, a room too narrow to have served as anything but a pantry or a child's sleeping alcove, that she noticed the built-in cupboard along the back wall sat slightly proud of the plaster around it, as though it had been added after the wall itself was finished, a discrepancy no wider than a hand's breadth but one that struck her stomach exactly the way a false figure in a ledger once had. She did not tear into it that first night, being too tired and too cold, but she returned to it the following morning with a pry bar borrowed from the one neighbor willing to speak to her, a weathered old cattleman named Hollis Dean who lived a mile off and who remembered the Prentice family, if barely from his own boyhood. Working the bar carefully along the seam Margaret had noticed, mindful of her aching hands, she found that the back panel of the cupboard was not fixed to the wall at all but sat in a shallow frame, and behind it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and brown with age, she found a bundle that would change everything she thought she knew about the land beneath her feet, and everything the town of Larkspur Hollow believed about its own quiet, respectable history. Inside the oilcloth were three things: a leather ledger book, its pages foxed and brittle but the ink still dark and legible, a hand-drawn map of the surrounding valley marked with symbols Margaret did not yet understand, and a folded letter, addressed simply to whoever finds this and is honest enough to use it right. The ledger, Margaret realized as she carried it to the kitchen table and began to read by lantern light with Hollis Dean looking gravely over her shoulder, belonged to a rancher named Josiah Prentice, the very man who had settled this land some 50 years before, and it recorded not cattle counts or feed purchases but something far stranger and far more consequential: a detailed, dated account of a silver strike Josiah Prentice had made on his own land in 1849, a modest vein he had deliberately concealed from the territory's mining speculators and from his own increasingly desperate land-grabbing neighbors, because he had watched what silver fever did to other honest families in other territories and wanted no part of the violence and greed it invited. The letter, in Josiah's own careful hand, explained why he had hidden it rather than worked it openly. He had seen a neighboring family torn apart by a gold claim 2 counties over, brothers turned against brothers, a father shot over a boundary line, and he had decided that a small, quiet ranch and an honest name were worth more to him than a fortune that would only draw wolves to his door. He had worked the vein secretly and sparingly over the years, just enough to secure his family's modest comfort, always careful, always hidden, and he had recorded every ounce in the ledger not out of greed but out of the same instinct that made Margaret's own mother keep honest books, because a true record, kept faithfully, was itself a kind of integrity, a promise to the future that nothing had been stolen or hidden in shame, only protected. But the map, Margaret saw with growing wonder, showed that Josiah had never finished working even the small portion of the vein he'd intended to, and the ledger's final entries, dated the autumn of 1851, broke off abruptly, the handwriting suddenly rushed and uneven where before it had been slow and careful. Hollis Dean, turning the ledger over in his weathered hands, told Margaret what little he remembered hearing as a boy, that the Prentice family had left Larkspur Hollow suddenly and without explanation sometime in the early 1850s, that some in town whispered they'd simply given up on hard land and gone west to try their luck in California, while others muttered darker things about a fever that took them all in a single terrible winter, and that whichever story was true no Prentice had ever been heard from again, and the land had simply sat abandoned, passed through tax sales and county rolls, until it came 40-some years later, into the possession of a discarded widow with $8 and a mule. It took Margaret the better part of 2 weeks, working carefully with Hollis Dean's help and the county's old land records, to piece together what had truly happened to Josiah Prentice, and what she found confirmed everything her mother had ever taught her about the patience required to read a true story out of an incomplete one. In the autumn of 1851 Josiah Prentice had died suddenly, not of fever as the town's kinder rumors suggested, but by violence, his death recorded in a single terse county coroner's line as an accident involving a fall from a horse, a line that Margaret's careful eye recognized immediately as the same kind of false, too tidy entry her mother had once taught her to distrust in a ledger. Digging further, cross-referencing old land transfer records with a dusty county file Hollis helped her track down at the courthouse, Margaret found that within a month of Josiah's death, a substantial portion of the surrounding grazing land that bordered the Prentice claim on 3 sides, had been quietly transferred to a rising young rancher in the valley, a man whose name struck Margaret like a slap when she first read it on the yellowed transfer document: Amos Coyle, her own husband. Daniel's great-uncle, the founding patriarch of the very Coyle family that had, 3 generations later, driven her out into a blizzard to die. The picture that assembled itself, ledger page by land record by whispered county memory, was not one Margaret could prove beyond every doubt, but it was one that sat true in her stomach the way a genuine figure always had, ever since she was a girl learning her mother's trade at the forge ledger. Amos Coyle, it seemed, had somehow learned of Josiah Prentice's hidden silver, whether through a careless word or a moment of misplaced trust, and had used that knowledge first to pressure the man for land and later, when persuasion failed, to simply take what he wanted after Josiah's convenient and unexamined death, buying up the surrounding claims for pennies from a grieving, frightened widow eager only to leave a place that had brought her nothing but tragedy. The vein itself, still largely unworked, had likely sat forgotten or deliberately ignored for decades. The Coyle family's later prosperity built not on the silver directly but on the good grazing land and water rights it had allowed them to seize, land that had quietly funded 3 generations of Coyle comfort while the family that had actually found the silver, and died protecting its secret from exactly the kind of greed that eventually claimed him, vanished from the county's memory entirely. Margaret sat with this knowledge for several long quiet evenings before she decided what, if anything, to do with it, because she understood, with the same clarity her mother had brought to every hard truth in a column of numbers, that knowledge like this could be used 2 very different ways. She could keep the maps secret entirely for herself, work what remained of the vein quietly as Josiah once had, and rebuild her own fortune in private, telling no one, owing nothing to a town that had watched Thomas Coyle abandon her in a storm and said nothing, done nothing, until a stranger's kindness happened to save her. It would have been, by any ordinary measure, entirely justified. But sitting in that small pantry room with Josiah Prentice's careful, honest ledger open before her, Margaret found herself thinking less about what she was owed and more about what kind of true thing she wanted her own life's final chapter to record, and she remembered her father's hands guiding hers along a piece of warped, discarded wood, teaching her that the measure of a thing's worth was never in what others had decided to throw away, but in what honest use you were willing to put it to, once it was in your keeping. Word travels fast in a small valley, and it was not many weeks before Thomas and Cora Coyle heard that the widow they had left on the county road that November night had not, as they'd quietly assumed, frozen or wandered off to some distant charity ward to be forgotten, but had instead purchased the old Prentice place and was, according to Hollis Dean's careless mention at the feed store, digging around out there like she's found something. Thomas arrived at the homestead on a cold afternoon in early spring, driving the same wagon he had once turned around on the county road, his face carrying an expression Margaret recognized immediately as the particular discomfort of a man who suspects he has made a mistake he cannot yet name. He was at first almost gentle, inquiring after her health with a courtesy that rang as false to Margaret's ear as any figure her mother had ever caught in a dishonest ledger, and it was only when Margaret mentioned, with deliberate calm, that she had found some old family papers belonging to the Prentice family and was looking into the history of the land, that she watched something harden behind Thomas's eyes, some inherited instinct passed down from Amos Coyle himself, and understood that the Coyle family's comfort had always rested, however unknowingly to Thomas himself, on a secret they could not afford to have surface. Cora came the following week, sharper and less patient than her husband, offering first a modest sum for the homestead, $20, more than double what Margaret had paid, and when Margaret declined, that offer curdled quickly into something closer to a threat, veiled in the polite language of concern for a frail old woman living alone on isolated, possibly dangerous land, concern that Margaret understood was really about how much the Coyle family stood to lose if the true history of their prosperity ever became common knowledge in a valley that prized honest dealing above almost everything else. Word began to spread through Larkspur Hollow in the careful, deniable way that word always spreads in small towns, whispers that the widow out at the old Prentice place was not quite right in the head, that she'd taken to digging in old wells and telling strange stories, whispers that Margaret recognized, with weary familiarity, as the exact same tactic her own family had once used to make her disappearance from their lives seem reasonable rather than cruel, and she understood that she was now fighting not only for the truth of what had happened to Josiah Prentice but for her own standing as a credible person in a town that had already shown it preferred a comfortable lie to an uncomfortable fact. It was Hollis Dean, gruff and unglamorous but entirely without guile, who became Margaret's steadiest ally through those difficult weeks, helping her comb through county records for anything that might corroborate the ledger's story beyond the word of an old widow the Coyles were actively working to discredit, and it was through Hollis's memory of his own late father, who had briefly worked as a young hand for Amos Coyle in the 1850s, that Margaret found her clearest piece of independent evidence, a battered journal kept in the Dean family attic in which Hollis's father had recorded, among ordinary ranch business, an uneasy entry from the autumn of 1851 noting that Amos Coyle had come into a sudden, unexplained quantity of raw silver or that he'd had quietly assayed in Cheyenne rather than through any local channel, precisely the kind of secretive, roundabout transaction an honest man had no need to arrange. With Josiah Prentice's ledger, his hidden map, his final unfinished letter, and now Hollis Dean's father's independent journal entry laid together on Margaret's kitchen table, the shape of the true story became undeniable even to a town inclined toward comfortable silence, and Margaret made the decision that would define the rest of her life. Rather than pursue the silver for herself, or take the Coyle family to whatever rough justice the territory's courts might offer for a 50-year-old crime that could likely never be fully proven in any formal sense, she would instead do what Josiah Prentice himself, by every honest word in his ledger, would have wanted done with a discovery he had always intended to use carefully and for the good of more than just himself. She called a meeting at the Larkspur Hollow town hall, inviting the whole valley, the Coyles included, and laid the entire story before them plainly, not as an accusation demanding punishment but as a record, kept faithfully in the old rancher's own honest hand, of a debt the valley itself had quietly and unknowingly been carrying for 2 generations. Thomas Coyle stood at the back of that crowded hall, and Margaret watched him understand in real time that the fortune his family had built, the very comfort that had allowed him to decide an old woman's life was an expense not worth carrying, rested on land his own great-uncle had taken through deception and likely violence from a man who had died trying to protect his community from exactly the kind of greed the Coyles had ultimately practiced. She did not demand the county seize his land, though by law she might have pressed such a claim. She asked only for one thing, that the remaining still unworked portion of the silver vein, which by Josiah Prentice's own careful map sat mostly beneath her purchased 22 acres and not the Coyle land at all, be recognized as rightfully hers, and that she be allowed to work it openly, honestly, and in full daylight, exactly as Josiah had once hoped some future, worthier hand might do. The town of Larkspur Hollow, which had been quietly declining for years as the good grazing land grew scarcer and younger families drifted toward richer counties, found in Margaret's discovery not scandal but opportunity, and Margaret, true to the values her mother's ledgers and her father's forge had instilled in her a lifetime before, chose to develop the vein not as a private fortune hoarded away but as a shared undertaking, hiring local hands at fair wages, funding the rebuilding of the town's failing schoolhouse and its long-neglected bridge over Miller's Creek and establishing, with the county's blessing, a small trust in Josiah Prentice's name to assist any family in the valley left destitute by hardship, storm, or misfortune, the very kind of assistance that had been denied to her on that terrible November night. Thomas Coyle, for his part, faced no dramatic public reckoning, no arrest, no mob justice, only the slow, thorough unraveling of a reputation built on land he could no longer pretend was innocently come by, as neighbors who had once done business with the Coyles without a second thought began, quietly and without any single dramatic confrontation, to remember Margaret's abandonment in the storm and to wonder, in the particular unhurried way small towns render their verdicts, what else the family might have been capable of. Cora eventually took their 2 sons and left the valley for a cousin's ranch in Nebraska, and Thomas remained, diminished, working land that had once made his family the wealthiest in the county but that now, without the easy credit and easy respect his name had once commanded, barely sustained him. A quiet, unspectacular justice that Margaret found, to her own surprise, brought her no satisfaction at all, only a tired, settled peace. 61 years old, and Margaret Coyle had been left to die in a blizzard by a family that measured her worth only in what she could still labor to provide them. She had walked out of that storm with $11 and a stubbornness inherited from a blacksmith father and a ledger-keeping mother, and she had spent 8 of those dollars on a ruin nobody else believed was worth the taxes owed against it. What she found sealed behind a pantry wall was not merely silver, though the silver mattered, and it did restore her, materially and completely, from a woman with nothing to a woman of genuine, comfortable means for the remainder of her days. What she found, more truly, was a 50-year-old debt of honesty that the whole valley had been unknowingly carrying, a debt she chose to settle not through vengeance but through the same quiet, faithful stewardship her mother had once taught her at a forge ledger table, understanding that a true accounting, kept and honored, was itself a form of justice more lasting than any single act of punishment could ever be. Margaret Coyle lived another 19 years on the old Prentice homestead, rebuilding its house board by careful board with her own 2 capable hands, and she was, by the time of her death in 1916, remembered throughout Larkspur Hollow not as the strange widow who dug in old wells, but as the woman who had looked at what an entire town had written off as worthless and found, within it, both a buried truth and a way to make it right. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with Margaret Coyle, and with the honest ghost of Josiah Prentice, who kept his secret not out of greed but out of love for a peace he hoped might outlast him. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs a reminder that value is so often hiding exactly where the world has stopped looking, and we would love for you to leave us a comment answering this. What is a time in your own life when you found real worth in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? We read every one of them and they remind us why we keep telling these stories. Until next time, stay close.